Let's begin by clarifying something fundamental when someone withdraws, when she goes silent, avoids messages, or seemingly disappears. It is extraordinarily tempting to interpret that behavior as personal. You assume malice. You think it's punishment. You think it's designed to inflict harm. But this is a tragic misreading of human psychology. People don't draw boundaries to push you away. They draw them because something inside them has already been pushed too far. When a person sets a boundary, they are not being cruel. They are finally choosing sanity over self-destruction. You are not entitled to the parts of someone they needed to reclaim in order to survive. The absence of a response is sometimes the only language a person has left to protect what remains of their identity. A boundary is not a wall. It's a declaration that one's worth is no longer negotiable. You may think she's cutting you off. What she's actually doing is closing a wound that was bleeding silently for far too long. People don't walk away when they feel safe. They walk away when every attempt to stay has eroded their sense of self. When you violate a boundary, you are not being passionate. You are being invasive. If someone has to repeat the same line, "I need space," over and over, what they're really saying is, "I don't feel safe saying no around you." Psychological maturity begins the moment you realize someone else's self-protection isn't your personal rejection. We've taught people that silence is hostility when, in truth, silence is often a desperate plea for internal peace. A person who has experienced emotional chaos learns to create order not by engaging, but by stepping back, by observing, by filtering their environment. Boundaries are the architecture of emotional survival, especially for those who have spent their lives being told their needs were too much. When you question someone's right to withdraw, you are unconsciously demanding access to their trauma without consent. A woman who has had to protect herself for years will not see your persistence as love. She will experience it as threat. You must understand that not every person who detaches is indifferent. Some are merely tired of negotiating their own worth. The truth is, some people can't afford to explain their boundaries. They're too busy trying to recover from what happened the last time they didn't have any. No one sets a boundary easily. It is born out of trial, out of tears, out of countless instances where leniency was mistaken for weakness. If she doesn't respond, it's not an act of war. It's an act of self-preservation practiced in silence. You don't get to decide what someone else finds overwhelming. That's not love. That's control disguised as care. The most violent thing you can do to someone who is healing is demand that they let down their guard for your comfort. She didn't become cold. She became careful. You cannot force intimacy from a person who had to teach themselves detachment to stay sane. When you say, "She's shutting me out," ask yourself, or is she finally letting herself in? There is no peace for someone who has never had the right to say no without punishment. People don't erect boundaries because they hate you. They do it because they've learned to stop hating themselves. You don't have to understand someone's trauma to respect the perimeter it created. She is not being distant. She is calibrating her energy so she doesn't implode in front of someone who wouldn't even notice. The need to defend your boundary is the clearest indicator that you've been around people who never honored it. Silence is not passive when it comes from someone who's always had to scream to be heard. To assume her distance is about you is to miss the entire story of what she survived just to hold herself together. She built the boundary not to exile others, but to finally belong to herself. It's not cruelty that drives a person to detach. It's the memory of being consumed every time they remained open. What you interpret as coldness may be the final stage of someone choosing mental clarity over emotional chaos. If you need someone to remain vulnerable for you, to feel powerful, you are not in love, you are in control. To honor someone's boundary is to declare, "I will not repeat the harm others inflicted in the name of affection." You don't teach someone to trust you by pushing past their limit. You earn it by not making them regret setting it. Every time you minimize a person's boundary, you increase their fear that no one will ever truly care without condition. People who've been gaslit don't need explanations. They need space, silence, and the right to interpret their reality without interference. She's not protecting herself from you. She's protecting herself from the version of you that refuses to listen. Boundaries don't end relationships. They reveal the parts of it that were already unsustainable. The idea that love means constant access is the reason so many people confuse possession with partnership. What she calls a boundary, you may call rejection, because your ego interprets limits as insults. The courage it takes to say enough is born from the exhaustion of always giving more than one can afford to lose. You are not being punished when someone goes silent. You are witnessing the echo of all the times they weren't allowed to. Do not mistake distance for disinterest. Sometimes it's the last line between healing and collapse. Boundaries don't need to be justified to those who have already overstepped. She isn't trying to teach you a lesson. She's finally learning one for herself, that peace is more important than being understood. Every time you violate someone's emotional boundary, you teach them to disappear in order to be safe. To someone who has been emotionally overwhelmed, even kindness without consent can feel like intrusion. The deepest form of respect is letting someone define their own limits, even if those limits exclude you. She didn't become distant overnight. She grew that way, word by word, wound by wound, until silence felt like home. The more you expect someone to explain why they need space, the less likely they'll feel safe enough to give it. You may feel shut out. But the truth is, she's finally no longer shutting herself down for your comfort. A person who has had to earn their safety will never see your pressure as love. It will always resemble danger. Boundaries are not an attack. They are a declaration that the person has survived enough not to tolerate one more inch of harm. What you perceive as rejection may be the echo of someone defending themselves from a world that never gave them safety to begin with. People who've been wounded deeply learn to wear armor so convincing you mistake it for indifference. When love has once been used as a trap, affection will look like bait and kindness will feel like risk. She is not shutting you out because you're insignificant. She's distancing herself because closeness once became a source of unbearable pain. Some learn that silence is safer than expression because every time they opened up, their words were used against them. You can't expect openness from someone who was once punished for being vulnerable. When someone grows up with betrayal, even sincerity feels suspicious. A person who's been emotionally manipulated doesn't fear loneliness. They fear false closeness disguised as connection. If she hesitates, it's not because she's cruel. It's because hesitation kept her alive when trust would have broken her. What you call a cold heart may be a heart trained to stay frozen so it doesn't shatter again. She's not rejecting you. She's rehearsing a habit that once protected her from losing herself completely. People who've been conditioned to expect chaos never trust peace without scanning for danger. Affection can trigger fear in someone whose past taught them that love is where the pain begins. If you haven't earned her trust, your presence may feel like noise to a nervous system still recovering from violation. She built a distance, not because she wants to hurt you, but because bridges burned once turned into cages she couldn't escape. Someone who has experienced emotional trauma will treat closeness like a storm warning. They prepare to run before they ever rest. When she doesn't reply, you assume she's ignoring you, but maybe she's battling her own mind just to breathe. The people who seem the most unreachable are often the ones who needed to shut down to survive. There's a war inside her between wanting to connect and fearing she'll be dismantled if she does. You can't ask someone to risk their soul if they've only just started stitching it back together. When you interpret her distance as rejection, you ignore the cost it took her to even interact at all. She doesn't want to be distant. She just doesn't know if you'll love her without tearing her apart. People who've had their love used against them learn to express nothing as a means of self-defense. You might feel pushed away, but in her mind, she's creating the only space where she feels safe enough to exist. Every time she holds back, she's not hiding. She's measuring the emotional cost of what you might do with her openness. Some people learned early that silence is the only way to stay sane when their feelings were never protected. What you interpret as ego is often a shield welded in childhood, forged in betrayal and honed in abandonment. She's not aloof. She's tired of decoding other people's lies dressed as affection. When someone's love was once weaponized, they will fear that every warm gesture is a setup for harm. To reach someone emotionally guarded, you don't kick down the door. You wait at the threshold with integrity and patience. If she pulls away, it might not be because she doesn't care. It may be because she cares too much and doesn't know how to survive if you leave. A person who has been emotionally violated doesn't reject love. They reject the illusion of it that once destroyed them. You can't expect someone to feel safe in your arms if every time they've trusted arms before, they were dropped. She's not playing games. She's navigating a mind that still links connection with catastrophe. To call her cold is to ignore the fire she once gave that burned her from the inside out. You can't love someone out of fear. They must choose to leave the cage, not be dragged from it. If she stays silent, understand that words have failed her before, and now she's testing the world for something more reliable. You are not the first person to try to enter her heart. She's just the first to finally stand guard at its gate. When love felt like manipulation, solitude becomes the only place that doesn't distort reality. She's not confused, she's cautious, and that caution was carved